We are now in the final stage of the first ever criminal trial of a former U.S. president. The 12-member jury made up of Manhattan residents began their deliberations today behind closed doors in Donald Trump's hush money election interference trial. Those deliberations began at 11:37 a.m. to be exact. For these jurors who have been sitting side by side in the courtroom for weeks, this was the first time they were allowed to speak to one another about the case. Up to that moment, the rules prohibited them from saying anything about this trial to one another as they listened to the prosecutors and the defense make their cases. The jury sent 2 notes to Judge Juan Marchand this afternoon, requesting to hear sections from various witness testimonies read back to them. 3 involving the former National Enquirer publisher David Pecker, and 1 from Trump's former lawyer Michael Cohen. That includes the testimony from both Pecker and Cohen from the August 2015 Trump Tower meeting, where the catch and kill scheme was discussed with Trump. They also asked to rehear the jury instructions that the judge had read to them this morning. Judge Marchand released the jurors after more than 4 hours of deliberations and told them to return tomorrow morning, at which point the testimonies will be read back to them. And then they will continue their deliberations over whether they believe Trump is guilty or not guilty of the 34 counts of falsifying business records in connection to the hush money payments made to adult film star Stormy Daniels near the end of the 2016 presidential campaign. Before the deliberations began, the judge carefully and in detail walked to the jury through the charges, making it clear what Trump was being charged with and what was required to prove beyond a reasonable doubt for a conviction. Some of those instructions could be seen as helpful to the defense, including the judge telling jurors that when weighing a witness's testimony, they could consider whether the witness had a motive to lie and an interest in the outcome of the case, and if the witness had been convicted of a crime or engaged in criminal conduct. And perhaps helpful to the prosecution was Marchand's jury instruction that when it comes to proving the underlying crime that would raise the falsification of business records to a felony, New York election law 17-152, which prohibits a conspiracy to promote or prevent the election of a person to public office by unlawful means, he told them, quote, "You need not be unanimous as to what those unlawful means were." And while we await a verdict from this jury, one thing we do know at this point, counter to all the whining coming from the defendant and his MAGA followers, is that Donald Trump was given the same rights as every other American citizen in our judicial system. In fact, it could even be argued he was given preferential treatment, especially given his repeated violations of his gag order. But like every other defendant, he was given his day in court. He was given the opportunity to testify on his own behalf, which he ultimately chose not to do. And now his fate is being deliberated by a jury of his peers. Joining me now is Lisa Rubin, MSNBC legal correspondent, who I ran into in the courtroom today because she was there. Andrew Weissman, MSNBC legal analyst and former federal prosecutor. Katie Phang, trial attorney and host of The Katie Phang Show. And Lachlan Cartwright, special correspondent for The Hollywood Reporter and former executive editor for The National Enquirer. He was also in court today and is a permanent captive here at MSNBC. We just keep you around. But I want to go to you first, Lisa, because I did get to see you today. I found the jury questions interesting, the things that they actually asked that they wanted to see more of. Talk more about that.
I thought it was absolutely fascinating. So, Joy, let's start from the presumption that the jury doesn't have these instructions with them. In fact, the second note that they sent today was a request to have some of them or all of them read back. We don't know exactly what yet. They have to clarify in the morning. But if you take on faith that they are moving through these instructions in the order that they were given to them.
Yes, that's what struck me too. They seem to be going in order, right?
Okay.
Yes.
So one of the things that I find really interesting is that there are obviously a bunch of instructions that are not specific to this crime. When you get to the stuff that is specific to the crime, it starts with, on page 27,
let me go to my page. This is like a Bible reading. Let me turn in your hymnals to page 27. The gospel of falsifying business records in the first degree. Hallelujah. Please read
so
on,
we
Pastor.
go to falsifying business records in the first degree. And it takes us through the required elements of falsification of the business records. it goes through all of that and various phrases that are important to that crime before it gets to the question of the underlying or the predicate crime that would bump it up to a felony. And that predicate crime is New York election law 17-152.
Yep.
That is the conspiracy to promote or prevent somebody's election to public office by unlawful means.
Right.
All the questions that they asked today, those 4 questions for specific testimony, all go to the question of the existence of the conspiracy and participation in certain acts that would have been in furtherance of the conspiracy. So one thing that you might be able to deduce from this is if they are going in order, and that's a big if, they may have already crossed the Rubicon of the falsification and decided that, yes, it did happen and Donald Trump is responsible for it, but they have to satisfy themselves that he is not just knowledgeable about the conspiracy, but an actual participant in it, and someone with knowledge of critical steps along the way.
Yeah, and one of the things that I did find interesting, just as a non-lawyer listening to it, is the judge is saying just being knowledgeable about the conspiracy and knowing it happened, that does not make you guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. He had to materially participate in it, but benefiting from it. Like, there were ways in which I'm like, he was really actually helping the prosecution. But I want to talk to you about this specific thing, because they went right to David Pecker's testimony. I'm going to put this back up on the jury notes. They wanted David Pecker's testimony regarding the phone conversation with Donald Trump while Pecker was in the investor meeting. They wanted Pecker's testimony regarding his decision not to finalize and fund Karen McDougal's life rights. They wanted Pecker's testimony regarding the August 2015 Trump Tower meeting. And they wanted Michael Cohen's testimony regarding the August 2015 Trump Tower meeting, Judge Merchan's jury instructions. And they wanted Judge Merchan's jury instructions reread to them. But I was very interested that they went right to Pecker's testimony.
And 2 of those requests relate back to that meeting at Trump Tower in August of 2015, just 2 months after Donald Trump announces that he is running for election, where David Pecker is called by Michael Cohen. He actually says he knew that they wanted something. That's the only reason he ever heard from Michael Cohen. And when he goes there, they say, well, what can you do for us? What can you do to help the campaign? And he says, I'll be the eyes and ears. I'll purchase negative stories off the market while also running negative stories about your rivals and also helping to promote Donald Trump. That is the layering of this conspiracy to influence the 2016 election. And then what happens is the sequence of events that follows. The Dino the Doorman payoff in the fall of 2015. In 2016, fast forward to the Karen McDougal payment, and then Stormy Daniels. And that one is crucial, obviously, because of the falsification of business records. That goes on because David Pecker says, I'm not going to be the bank. I'm not going to stump up the money here. And then in early 2017, they then cook up this plot to falsify the business records. But what is the layering of all of that? Is that meeting. And that is why David Pecker is essential here in that testimony, because he then puts Donald Trump in the room, much like that phone call at the investor conference. He then illustrates to the jury that Donald Trump had knowledge of the Karen McDougal situation.
And here's the thing. This is where it comes to, and I'm going to ask you this question because you are both a journalist and an attorney, that it comes to the question of whether or not what David Pecker is doing is proper journalism, legitimate journalism that he would have done regardless of who Donald Trump is, or whether or not it was a campaign contribution. This is the law, the Federal Election Campaign Act. They were calling it FECA sometimes in court. Under the Federal Election Campaign Act, it is unlawful for an individual to willfully make a contribution to any candidate with respect to an election or federal office, including the office of President of the United States, which exceeds a certain limit, that limit being $2,700. So the question then becomes, are these schemes that David Pecker is engaged in, him doing what he would normally do, are catch and kill just a thing, or was he making a contribution? He already pleaded guilty basically to doing that.
Yes, and
or made a deal.
And there was a conciliation agreement,
non-prosecution
a non-prosecution agreement.
Yes.
But what's important is Joshua Steinglass touched on all of this, and I want to re-up this because I was looking like maybe I was the contrarian on the Prime panel last night when I said I didn't have a problem with the 4 hours from Joshua Steinglass. And the reason why is he had one bite at the apple. He was the last voice that was heard by the jury, and he had to go through all of the evidence. And the reason why I bring that up is Steinglass said in his closing arguments, right, the value of what was provided from these catch and kill schemes was invaluable. You couldn't actually put a price tag on it because it helped him, as in Donald Trump, in a way that perhaps you couldn't even put a dollar sign on it. And I think also we need to remember there have been 22 witnesses in this case, 6 weeks of trial. David Pecker was the first witness that was called. So to some extent, it could just be something as much as I need to just have a refresh of my recollection, to use a trial term, of what David Pecker said. But it also could go to the accomplice as a matter of law during instruction. Page 22.
Let me turn to my
Page
hymnal.
22.
Hold on a second. I got to turn to
So
my hymnal.
this is the jury instruction
Okay.
that a lot of us had raised eyebrows about when we heard it read to the jury today, because it specifically identifies Michael Cohen as an accomplice to a crime.
Yes.
And
yes.
it says under our law, meaning New York law, you cannot convict a defendant based solely on the testimony or the evidence provided by an accomplice. So you'd ask yourself, well, how does that make sense? Because jurors should be allowed to, determine the credibility of any witness in a trial. But New York law says you can't convict solely on the testimony or the evidence provided by an accomplice.
Right.
However, if that testimony is supported by corroborative evidence tending to connect Trump with the commission of that crime, then you can convict.
Yeah.
So if you marry together David Pecker, his testimony from that Trump Tower meeting, that with Michael Cohen, and then you also get to what I call the original sin.
Yeah.
The original sin was that 2015 Trump Tower meeting. It was
That's right.
always, let's do the catch and kill, because we know that you've announced your candidacy, or unofficially at that point, and we know that that's what the ultimate goal is. And so it's a very elegant way to tie it all together. And you'd like to think that the jury took Steinglass's closing. It was the last thing they heard when they went to bed last night, and they walked into deliberations.
And what I love about the way this jury is working, and if I were a juror, I would do this too, only because it's easier to go back to the beginning, back to the first witnesses, go back to David Pecker and proceed from there. That's what it looks like they're doing. They're being methodical. Let me read this. This is about David Pecker's credibility. You will recall that you heard testimony. This is the judge speaking to the jury. And that while David Pecker was an executive at AMI entered into a non-prosecution agreement with federal prosecutors, as well as a conciliation agreement with the Federal Election Commission. I remind you that evidence was permitted to assist you, the jury, in assessing David Pecker's credibility and to help provide context for some of the surrounding events. You may consider that testimony for these purposes only. Neither the non-prosecution agreement nor the conciliation agreement is evidence of the defendant's guilt, and you may not consider them in determining whether the defendant is guilty or not guilty. But it's a reminder that the thing that he did a non-prosecution agreement about is this.
Mother Teresa could not beat these charges. These charges are rigged. The whole thing is rigged.
Remind me again, Donald, when Mother Teresa paid off a porn star to cover up an affair? Trump sounds like a man who knows his fate rests in the hands of 12 jurors. And while there's nothing he can do to sway the jury, he and his allies are doing their best to prime the MAGA faithful for the verdict with an alternate universe of lies. In his courthouse comments, he lied about Judge Juan Marchand barring witnesses that his own lawyers decided not to call, and a host of other imagined grievances. He also wrote on his social media, "I don't even know what the charges are in this rigged case," literally moments after Judge Juan Marchand's jury instructions detailed the charges against him. Capping off a tear where he all caps screamed about a kangaroo court and claimed that he had no rights because of his gag order, never mind the fact that he could have testified in his own defense but didn't. And if this all seems familiar, it's a recreation of the constellation of election lies in the lead up to the January 6, 2021 insurrection. And Trump's lies are going straight from his mouth into MAGA veins, as evidenced by the signs I saw with my very own little eyes, parroting his claims outside the courthouse today. Joining me now is Tim O'Brien, senior executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion and MSNBC political analyst. Always good to see you, Tim. But one of the things that I did notice between the first time I went and this time is that there were actually people there. The first time there were no Trump supporters. There were no protesters. It wasn't a lot, but it seemed very coordinated because he tweeted some specific language. That language was on a sign.
They still haven't learned how to pronounce Justice Marchand's name, however. They were out there yelling, going, Merchant. Merchant Marine.
How much do you think, I mean, having dealt with him and covered him for so long, how fearful do you think he is tonight?
I think everything he's doing, indicates panic. He's got nonsensical, capitalized truths. I guess I hate calling them truths, but post to his truth account.
Yeah.
And I think he feels cornered. I think he has for some time. Yeah. And as the trial wears along and the evidence creeps up, I think it puts him in a real corner. And I think he feels that, I think perhaps he's been sleeping during some portions of
the
court.
times when he leans back and his eyes
he closes
are closed.
his eyes, and I actually think he's in this fugue state, and he's trying to pretend that what he's confronting in that courtroom doesn't exist. Yeah. The same way a small child, if you tell a small child they've done something wrong and they stick their fingers in their ears and they say, yeah, that didn't happen. I think that's where he's at.
Fugue state. He tweeted, he did fundraising email saying, I could be in jail tomorrow. Okay. he's sort of freaking out. He's having his allies like J.D. Vance and Elise Stefanik investigate Judge Juan Marchand and all of that sort of stuff. But to me, between the irony of what he did to persecute the Central Park Five, he's now feeling what those 14 and 15-year-old boys were feeling, and he had no empathy for them. But he wants sympathy for feeling the same fear of whether it's going to be guilty or no guilty. And then the other one that I think is so ironic is that if he is convicted, there's a question of whether he could actually lose his right to vote in the state of Florida, where the current governor, Ron DeSantis, he gleefully strips black people of their right to vote and sends his election police after them. Well, my dear, orange is the new black.
That's right. And that's DeSantis looking back to prior efforts to enfranchise people who have been incarcerated and allow them to vote.
Yeah.
And he's now undermined the person he's supporting in this election.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible that he would have to actually petition his former rival, who they went at it and fought. He would actually have to likely petition Governor DeSantis, who doesn't like giving people their right to vote, for him to be able to vote for himself in November.
Well, and I think that is probably the least front of mind thing for Donald Trump.
Oh, I'm sure.
I think what he's really focused on is the idea that he might lose his liberty.
Yeah.
And I didn't think going into this case that was necessarily going to be an outcome.
Sure.
And having sat there, I don't know if you went through this when you were sitting down there, but when you watch the prosecution methodically lay out an airtight case that is really, I think, sitting there irrefutable. Yeah. Whether or not it elevates to a felony, whether or not the jury believes that this, 34 what are currently misdemeanors become felonies because they were in the service of election interference.
Yeah.
I think that's still a wild card.
Yeah.
But if we get there, I think that Justice Merchan is going to be obviously a pivotal figure in all this.
And the thing is that the way that he did these jury instructions was fascinating in the sense that it gives jurors ways to compromise and convict on some and not on others. There's a possibility of split verdicts, of compromise verdicts, but it's very hard to get around the facts, which the defense really didn't refute.
And it's one of the many elegant and I think graceful aspects of the way that Justice Merchan has presided over this trial. His daughter has been attacked.
Yeah.
He's been attacked. The entire process in the court system has been attacked. He's an American success story.
Yes, he is.
He's an immigrant who is self-made, and he has sat in that courtroom and been very measured. I think only a couple times he's lost his patience. It's never risen to shouting, but he's gotten very upset a few times at Todd Blanche, who's a court jester, no pun intended. But throughout, I think Merchan has really been an exemplary person that most of us could try to latch onto as an idea about how to conduct oneself in the midst of chaos.
Indeed. It is fascinating that he comes originally from the same place as Judge Aileen Cannon, but they are very different jurists.
Very
different. Tim O'Brien, my friend.
Thank you, Joy.
Thank you very much.